out in the lands of danger and flame. Heroes of legend are making their name. Swords and spells with hearts full of zest. They ride with pride on a quest of interest. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Mystic lands and monsters to face. They're saving the world at a breakneck pace. From the Verdant province to Dragon's Lair, wicked wizards and trolls beware. With the rogue a knight and a mage so wise, they'll outwit danger and claim the prize. Legends told round campfire flames of secret spells and forgotten names. A hidden power, an ancient key. The fate of the realm is their destiny. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Curses, traps, and mysteries deep. No dragon's hoard is out of reach. They laugh at danger, they don't play it safe. Each wild adventure's a tale of interest. A caress. Heckfire Club, tales of interest.
The adventurers had braved the blasted canyons, a vast, unforgiving expanse of sun-scorched rock and shifting dunes, in search of a Vestran orb, an artifact of immense power. Along the way, they uncovered cryptic carvings and shattered ruins, piecing together the story of a lost civilization that had once wielded the power to bend nature to its will. The deeper they ventured, the more they realized they were not the only ones searching. Signs of draconic forces had marked the land, evidence of an army seeking the same prize. Their journey had led them to encounter sharp-beaked gricks, magma fiends, raging sandstorms, an evening with an enigmatic shaman, and the tale of the long-forgotten draconic legion's mutiny, now buried by the ever-changing landscape. At the heart of the canyon's ruins they'd found what that army had sought, an ancient temple, half buried in the sands, the final resting place of something older than the desert itself. But the treasure had not been left unguarded. The ancient guardian stalking the buried pyramid's courtyard, a courtyard filled with obelisks, statues and sand-whipped columns, was no longer a mere plodding sentry. In his haste to uncover what his patron so desperately sought, Thomas had moved swiftly over the sands, his form rendered invisible by magic, a spectral shadow flitting between the crumbling ruins. But in his singular focus he had overlooked one fatal detail. While his body could not be seen, his footsteps in the sand very much could be. The moment he realized his mistake, it was too late. The golem's massive head had snapped toward the shifting dunes, its form twisting with unnatural speed as it locked onto the disturbance. With a thunderous roar, it had charged, the ground shaking beneath its monumental stride, its colossal fists rising to obliterate the unseen intruder. The air rushed past Thomas, a wall of pure force barreling toward him. And so we find our adventurers today engaged with the Sand Golem, guardian of legendary relics of Ozymandias, King of Kings. The warlock barely had time to react before the golem's titanic fist came crashing down, the air rippling from the force of the blow. The ground where Thomas had stood fractured outward in a web of cracks, but he was gone, vanishing in a haze of misty steppe. Across the battlefield, Zora caught a sharp whistle cutting through the howling winds. His gaze snapped to the horizon, where a halfling's dune boat skimmed impossibly fast across the sands, its kite sail billowing in the dying light. At the stern, Celia Sundance moved before the dust had even settled, leaping from the vessel with effortless grace. She rolled into a battle stance, joining the fight with the practiced ease of a warrior born for such moments. The adventurers wasted no time manoeuvring with precision to surround the golem, their invisibility still holding for now. Yet, the construct was older than memory itself, its senses woven into the very sands it commanded. It unravelled before them, collapsing into a storm of dust and wind, shifting beyond the reach of sight. Frizz, sensing the danger, made a split-second decision. Whispering an incantation, she shrank herself, leaving only faint, near-invisible prints in the swirling sands. The deception worked. The golem reconstituted itself, scanning for movement, but it could not find what was no longer there. Thomas seized the moment, extending his hand as a void of writhing blackness erupted in the heart of the battlefield. Hunger of Hadar clawed at reality itself, its abyssal tendrils wrapping around the golem's form. It should have worked. But the golem was older than such magic, its very essence woven into the desert's fury. With a thunderous roar, it tore itself free, hurling a storm of razor-sharp sand toward Thomas and Frizz, shredding their robes, cutting deep into their skin. Blinded, Thomas stumbled back, instinct driving him toward cover. He dashed behind an ancient obelisk, gripping its smooth surface, his breath ragged as the storm battered against the stone. Zirath saw the warlock's plight but did not falter. His holy radiance cut through the storm, his axe glowing as he brought it down in a mighty arc, slicing deep into the golem's shifting form. Zora moved in tandem, his blade carving into the ancient construct, striking at its core. Frizz, blinking past the sting of blood and sand, clenched her fists and made a choice. She called upon power not entirely her own, channeling golden light through her trembling hands with a bless spell. Celia, Zirath, and Zora were bathed in its warmth, their movements sharpening, their strikes guided by unseen force. Stealth was gone, but strength had taken its place. The golem shifted too fast, its massive fist swinging toward Zirath. The impact sent the paladin skidding back, carving deep trenches into the sand. Blood trickled down his brow, his arms shaking from the sheer force, but his golden eyes burned with defiance. The battle raged on, the storm a living thing, but the adventurers did not waver. Frizz, wounded but resolute, raised her hands and unleashed searing bolts of fire, scorching ray striking true, blackening the golem's surface with each impact. Yet it did not fall. It collapsed once more, vanishing into the sands, its presence everywhere and nowhere. And then it struck from behind, tendrils of living sand coiled around Zora, locking his limbs, pulling him toward the earth. The barbarian roared, his fury pushing against the restraints, but even his raw strength could not break free. The golem loomed over him, its form shifting, rising, preparing a final devastating blow. Celia moved first. She danced between its strikes, her staff a blur, landing blow after blow with perfect precision. Zirath, watching the battle unfold, could not deny his admiration for Monk's martial abilities. Her balance, her speed, the sheer force of her strikes. The storm raged, the sands devouring sight, but Thomas found his moment. He lifted his hand, summoning the full weight of his patron's will. The air hummed with dark energy, his vision narrowing to a single perfect opportunity. Eldritch blasts tore through the storm, striking true, leaving the golem reeling. It turned toward him. Thomas had its full attention now. The golem summoned another storm, sand howling in a blinding fury, forcing Thomas back. Zora, still trapped, bellowed in defiance. His rage surged, his muscles trembling with impossible strength as he tore himself free, shattering the hardened sand restraints. With a single devastating strike, he drove his blade deep into the weakened leg Zirath had struck moments before. The golem reeled, enraged. With one final act of defiance, it seized Zora, hurling him through the air. The half-elf collided with a stone pillar, the impact sending cracks racing through the ancient structure. He did not rise. Celia was at his side in an instant, her hands pressed against his chest, her ki flowing outward. She would not let him fall. Zora's eyes flickered open. Alive. Weakened, but alive. But Frizz had seen enough. Raising her hands, she called forth a final searing spell. The air ignited as a fireball erupted across the battlefield, its blinding heat consuming the golem in flame and fury. Yet even now it endured. The ground itself shifted, turning the battlefield into a sea of quicksand. Celia, Zirath, and Zora, standing their ground, began to sink, their movements slowing. The golem loomed, preparing to strike the final blow. Zirath refused to fall. With one last defiant leap, he burst from the sinking sands, his axe burning with divine power. He brought it down with everything he had left, his final divine smite pouring into the strike. The golem fractured. With a final deafening crack, its form shattered, dissolving into nothing more than lifeless sand. The storm ceased. The wind stilled again for the first time since the battle began. The desert fell silent. Bloodied, breathless, but victorious, the adventurers stood amid the ruins of their battle, the last ones left standing. From the dust and settling silence, a figure emerged. A halfling, clad in desert leathers, stood atop the wondrous dune boat. The halfling, calling himself Dune Strider, leapt from the deck of the Windrunner, his boots landing lightly in the sand as if he had stepped onto solid ground. The ship, its sleek runners barely sinking into the dunes, rocked slightly before steadying itself, its sail twitching in the restless desert wind. Raylan moved like a man who had never fought against the sand, only ever flowed with it. Sun-bronzed and lean, his wiry frame was wrapped in a sand-coloured tunic embroidered with the glyphs of his people. His wild, greying mane of curly brown hair was tousled by the wind, and his sun-sharpened hazel eyes, filled with quiet mirth, swept over the adventurers. There was no fear in his gaze, nor hesitation, only curiosity, tempered by the instinct of a man who had spent his life reading both people and the dunes alike. A finely crafted scimitar, its blade engraved with ancient runes, rested at his hip, and the faintest clink of glass vials filled with desert remedies accompanied his steps. He came to a halt before the adventurers, taking in the wreckage of the fallen sand golem, the weary stances of warriors who had battled something ancient and won. His expression was one of quiet amusement, but beneath it lay something else, respect and perhaps a hint of recognition. Few had ever ventured far enough to challenge the golem. None had stood victorious. His voice, when it came, was soft and measured. His name was given, his clan named, and a simple truth spoken. The peoples of the desert had taken notice of them. Their clans had tracked the strangers from the moment they entered the blasted canyons. Whispers had spread fast, word of their prowess against the trials held in the canyons. The dunes spoke of their names now, he said, and their peoples had questions. As he spoke, the captain turned his gaze to the horizon. The desert was not ruled by one people alone. There were 3 tribes that still roamed its expanse in the dunes, the canyons, and the caverns. It so happened, Raylan explained, that near the southern bamboo hills, the bordering villages of the monks oft had dealings with the halflings of the deserts. When the dune riders had carried word westward to the bamboo hills that a paladin, a wizard, a barbarian, and a warlock had entered the desert, the monks had sent a runner into the hills to find a certain Celia Sundance to hear the story. Raylan Dune Strider, who had been trading with the monks at the time, admitted to having been fascinated by this strange group. He was a man who enjoyed living a good story. So with that, he agreed to brave the eastward sandstorm to carry Celia with all the speed his dune ship could muster. There was much to say, but first Friz with wide eyes simply could not contain her curiosity. Her notebook was out before she had even realized it, her quill darting across the pages as she examined the ship, bombarding the halfling captain with questions. The mechanics, the angles, the wind resistance. Her mind raced to understand how such a vessel could move as it did. The captain, amused, offered only vague responses, revealing little beyond what he wished them to know. Some secrets of the desert were meant to be earned, not explained. The conversation shifted, as it always did, toward the task at hand. Thomas did not waste time. His question was simple. What did the captain know of the ancient king Ozymandias? The name alone was enough to strip the mirth from the halfling's face. Ozymandias was no mere king. He had ruled a vast desert oasis stretching east to west and further south than anyone had gone in memory. He raised great and vast cities, his empire built on chains and suffering. His slaves, the ancestral halflings of the desert clans, had built under arcane lash many great works to his unceasing vanity. His face darkened. The oasis was not a natural formation. Zora, at those words, remembered the whale bones they had found near the cavern of the shaman. Blood magic had fueled Ozymandias's kingdom, its rituals sustaining his empire, until, without warning, the sands reclaimed it, erasing it from existence. Many had sought its ruins, treasure hunters, scholars, fools, but none had returned. Yet Raylan admitted with a note of intrigue that the adventurers had already come farther than any before them. Zora leaned forward, arms crossed, and recounted their bizarre encounter with the shaman of the blasted canyons, his cryptic ramblings, his unsettling shifts between madness and sudden clarity, as though straddling the boundary between truth and delirium. Raylan listened with quiet amusement, his sharp eyes glinting with familiarity. When the story was done, he chuckled, not in disbelief, but with a knowing air of recognition. He confirmed what they already suspected. Those who had met the shaman and survived all said the same thing. The man was impossibly old, and just as the merchant had warned, there was something deeply, fundamentally off about him. The adventurers exchanged glances. The shaman's madness had been real, but his insights had been too precise, too eerily accurate to dismiss. He spoke in riddles, but within them lay a terrible, buried logic. Raylan studied them a moment longer, then with casual ease posed an odd question. How many gricks had they put in the soup? There was no explanation, no elaboration, just the question, as if the number itself mattered. Zora answered first, recounting the battle in the sand. The ambush, the chaos, the writhing mass of tentacled Moors. 6 had fallen beneath steel and spell. Raylan nodded, satisfied, though not without caution. 6 was good. 6 was manageable. Any more, and the dunes would have stirred with something worse. Too many hatchlings, and the mother comes looking. His words settled heavily between them, spoken not as a warning, but as a simple fact of survival, as natural as drinking water before the midday sun. Unease flickered between Thomas and Frizz. The shaman's questioning, his insistence on the count, hadn't been meaningless. He had known exactly what he was asking. And now, the pattern in his madness felt far more unsettling than the madness itself. The question from Raylan that followed was inevitable. What, the halfling wanted to know, were they truly seeking in the lands of his people? Zareth and Frizz were the ones to answer. They sought an Orb of Vestra, a powerful orb from a time of legends said to be linked to sorcerer blood magic. There was no laughter at their claim, no scoffing at their ambition. The halfling only listened, considering. The stories had spoken of Ozymandias wielding an artifact of terrible power. The sun itself, it was said, held in the palm of his hand. He admitted the peoples of the desert did not know of its origins or makings. What was certain was that he had not wielded it alone. By his side had stood his dark mage lord, Syrinx, the architect of the blood rituals. This buried pyramid, he said, had been the temple and tomb of Syrinx himself. The halfling did not deny the possibility that such an object still lay beneath the sands. But he did not offer reassurances either. The magic of Ozymandias had demanded too steep a price. The orb, if it still existed, would not be found without consequence. The past did not belong only to ruins. The desert itself had memory, and it did not forgive. Thomas recognized an amusing curiosity in him, much like that of Frizz when seeing some kind of new magical doodad or a fragment from lost dwarven soap recipes. But he kept that thought to himself. None could say what lay within the temple of the mage lord Syrinx. Its doors had been sealed since the day the empire had fallen, untouched by time, hidden beneath the sands. If there were riches, they were, as far as his people knew, still there. If there were dangers, they were waiting. The captain gave his offer and his warning. He would allow them one day. No more. If they wished to return through the storms, if they wished to ride the sands back west, that would be their window. The halfling did not part with many friendships, nor did he grant favours without reason. But for them, there would be this. A friend of the monks was a friend to the halflings. The last words he left them with were not of encouragement nor of fortune. Not all things buried should come to light, and with that, Raylan Dune Strider sought the shade of the Wind Rider's sails, placing a small cushion in the sands, and whistled a tune as he pulled a bag of figs from his pack. As friendly as he was to Thomas, it seemed like if they weren't back out of the temple before the next sunrise, Raylan would only add this encounter as one more curious story of many he undoubtedly had. Zirath agreed. He was friendly, but that didn't fully make him a friend. The adventurers were left standing before the great stone door, the last road into a kingdom that had long buried by time. The sands shifted beneath their feet, and the ruins of Syrinx, mage lord to Ozymandias, king of kings, waited. The massive stone door loomed before them, its ancient carvings worn by time yet untouched for centuries. As the dust settled from battle, they studied the entryway and the statues flanking the threshold, their resemblance to those in the courtyard unmistakable, though what it meant remained unclear. Speculation erupted. The statues were too large to move, but perhaps an offering or a command could trigger the door. Zora briefly suggested punching one to see what happened. Frizz, already focused, examined the engravings with careful scrutiny. A flicker of understanding crossed her face as she turned toward the statues, staring for a long moment while the others continued their wild theories, oblivious to the fact that she had already solved the puzzle. Without a word, she strode toward the statues. The group fell silent, watching as she stopped at the base of one, eyes locked on its twisted hands, positioned in the opposite direction of those carved into the door. A small smirk played at her lips, not out of vanity, but for the love of putting pieces together. Climbing onto the statue's base, she grasped its massive hand and twisted. A deep, grinding sound echoed through the chamber. Celia, needing no further instruction, was already moving. In a blur, she leapt onto the second statue, mirroring Frizz's action with effortless precision. Another groan of shifting stone rumbled through the temple. From beneath the sands, long dormant mechanisms stirred, the ground trembling slightly as fine grains began trickling from unseen vents near the doorway. Frizz watched, head tilted in quiet satisfaction, already unravelling the mechanics in her mind. The statues were locks, and the shifting sand, a counterweight system. She mused aloud about the brilliance of ancient desert engineering, her voice carrying the unmistakable confidence of someone who had outpaced the puzzle before them. Without hesitation, the others followed as she strode back toward the now unsealed door. If Frizz had determined it was safe, that was all the assurance they needed. Whatever lay beyond the entrance was still a mystery, but one thing was certain. When it came to unravelling the secrets of forgotten civilizations, there was no sharper mind than Frizz the Wiz, her intellect as unshakable as her bright red hair shining in the desert sun. As the adventurers stepped beyond the threshold, the dim glow of their torches flickered against the vast looming walls, illuminating stories carved into the stone itself, histories preserved in the cold embrace of the tomb. As they stepped into the chamber, they noticed that the darkness was not absolute. High above, where the ceiling curved into vast, seamless arches, shafts of light poured in from unseen openings, refracted and guided by an intricate network of polished crystal lenses set into the stone. Hieroglyphs stretched in endless procession, winding up and down the chamber's walls, chronicling an empire of impossible grandeur. The vainglorious nature of the art was plain. At the far end of the chamber, an immense slab loomed, its surface carved with symbols painted in long-faded pigments: a red sun, green fields, blue waters, yellow sands, a depiction of a world once reclaimed from oblivion, a paradise pulled from the desert. And yet, it had all been buried. At the centre of the room, a staircase spiralled downward, its steps vanishing into darkness. Around it, countless passages branched outward, their depths unknown, their directions uncertain. The pyramid was not merely a tomb. It was a labyrinth, a city beneath the sand, its true breadth incredible. One hall stretched to the left, built with perfectly fitted stones that were laid carefully at intricate and nearly seamless angles. After a brief discussion, they all agreed they would first head downward. The descent into the depths of the pyramid twisted and coiled like the path of a mind lost in its own thoughts. They were travelling through something vast, too vast for what should have been just another burial tomb. This place had served a purpose. And then they stepped into something wholly unexpected, a grand library. Ancient scrolls lay in piles, rolled and tumbled in great heaps, as if a storm of parchment had once swept through the chamber and left chaos in its wake. Yet despite the disorder, there was clear organisation. Shelves lined the walls, massive wooden cases carved with intricate glyphs that marked where different codices and tomes were stored. Scrolls and books rested in careful stacks, preserved against the erosion of time. The party barely had time to react before a shift in the air signalled something moving nearby. The sound of metal clanging against stone echoed through the halls. Footsteps, slow and measured, shuffled from behind the towering cases of ancient knowledge. Then, a hand, large, dry, wrapped in age-worn bandages, reached around the corner of a shelf, its long bony fingers adorned with rings of gold, its wrist heavy with thick, jewelled bracelets. The figure stepped forward, revealing a dusty, half-wrapped mummy, its body clothed in the tattered finery of a scholar from a long-forgotten era. Golden ink pots dangled from its decorated belt, swinging gently with each laboured step. A collection of spectacles, some pristine, others cracked, hung from thin golden chains, an array of corrective lenses for eyes that no longer remained. And yet the mummy had none to wear them for. Its face, slack-jawed and wizened, bore only empty sockets where its eyes should have been. A rattling wheeze escaped its throat as it halted, its head tilting in eerie silence. Then, with a surprisingly gentle voice, it spoke. It wanted to know if someone was there. The party collectively tensed. Thomas sighed, already predicting the ungodly ancient evil that what was coming. Zora ran a hand to his sword, inhaling a sharp breath. Celia and Zirath readied for combat as well. When the figure finally turned the corner, Friz beamed. Before them stood a rather sorry-looking mummified scholar. With the enthusiasm of someone who had just found a kindred spirit, she greeted the mummy warmly, her voice brimming with the kind of respect one scholar shows another. To her, this wasn't a cursed undead guardian in a mage lord's buried tomb. No, this was, first and foremost, a librarian. The mummy, startled by the cheerful response, coughed, a tragic, dust-filled sound, and apologised for the state of the library, explaining that things had gotten a bit disorganised over the centuries. It would have tidied up, of course, but unfortunately it had misplaced its eyes some time ago, and well, that had made things rather difficult. For a moment silence hung in the air as the sheer comedic tragedy of the scene sank in. Thomas exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose. Of course this was happening. It had all the makings of some cosmic joke. A cursed, undying librarian entombed in a labyrinth of knowledge for millennia. Unable to fulfill his one purpose because his eyes had gone missing. He could only imagine the sympathy radiating off of Friz right now. Zirath, ever cautious, kept a hand on his axe. None of this made any sense. Ancient mummies in cursed pyramids were not supposed to welcome guests with soft apologies about poor organisation and lost personal belongings. This entire situation was a riddle unto itself, and he had yet to decide whether the punchline would involve fire and steel. But as the dust continued to swirl in the dim torchlight and the sound of the pyramid's deep, unseen machinery still echoed faintly in the distance, the librarian stood patiently, waiting, tilting his head as if trying to sense the presence of those who had, against all odds, wandered into his domain. The mummy straightened, what little papery flesh remained on his face shifting as he spoke, with a voice far softer than anyone expected from an ancient corpse. He introduced himself as Shamael, Grand Tome Keeper of the Mage Lord Syrinx, though in life, he admitted, Most had simply called him Sam. The title, once heavy with honour and duty, now seemed little more than an echo of a forgotten past, his hands gesturing vaguely at the towering shelves around them. Celia, ever the curious one, tilted her head and asked the question hanging in the air. What exactly had happened to his eyes? The mummy sighed, a rattling, breathless wheeze that sent a small puff of dust into the air. His posture slumped slightly, as though recounting an old grievance to an old friend. The royal guard had stormed into the temple on the orders of the high priests, rounding up every scholar, scribe, and servant within the halls. It was time, they had been told, to seek eternal life. Some had rejoiced at the news, eagerly stepping forward with hands clasped in prayer. Others, like Sam, had been less enthused, particularly as they were unceremoniously dragged toward the mummification chambers, with a speed that suggested efficiency had taken precedence over quality. The process had been rushed. Normally, such rituals took weeks, ensuring a seamless transition between life and eternity. But on that day, something else had been happening, something wrong. People had been screaming, priests arguing, talk of an uprising in the city-states. The incantations had been hurried, the sacred rites performed sloppily, and the magic hadn't quite taken hold the way it should have. Shamael or Sam had awoken a few thousand years ago. It was not the ascendant experience one might expect. His first moments of eternal consciousness had been met with an eerie stillness, the sensation of linen wrapped too tightly around his limbs, and the disorienting realization that he had been stored in a rather large, ornate tomb with himself. It seemed that his various vital organs had been neatly arranged into a series of sacred jars, his brain in one, his tongue in another. The whole setup had been very orderly, which he could appreciate as a librarian, but the lack of eyes had been frustrating. He had searched for them, of course. At first he had been optimistic. They had to be somewhere, probably misplaced or shuffled onto the wrong shelf in the chaos of his preservation. But after a few centuries of dedicated looking, he had begrudgingly given up. Instead, he had spent a few hundred years wandering the twisting halls and endless staircases, getting lost more times than he cared to count, before finally feeling his way back to the library, where at last things made sense again. Most of the party groaned, exchanging exhausted glances, some rubbing their temples as if the sheer absurdity of the situation was physically painful. Thomas, in particular, muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, "Of course it's a blind librarian, why wouldn't it be?" Friz, however, remained utterly unfazed. If anything, she seemed moved. With a sincerity that baffled everyone, she remarked how terribly sad that must be for him. To spend millennia unable to read, trapped in the halls of knowledge without the one thing that made it worthwhile. Surely he must miss reading. The mummy exhaled another dusty sigh, his head nodding in solemn agreement. Oh, how he missed it. He was at heart a lover of poetry. That, more than anything, gave Friz a surprised look. Of all the things she had expected, poetry had not been one of them. Fiction and stories, she understood. But librarians lived for facts, for records and history. Sam, with the air of a man sharing his deepest sorrow, revealed that his favourite piece was a particularly tragic romance epic, one that had once been recounted and discussed in hushed whispers through the royal courts and libraries. It was about a young maiden caught in the throes of love, torn between the affections of two immortal beings, one, a proud, passionate werewolf, the other, a brooding, sorrowful and pale vampire. This time, without a word, they all turned their heads toward each other, expressions unreadable. An entire conversation took place in silence, one of mutual understanding, of unspoken horror. The story sounded kind of dumb. And yet none of them had the heart to say it, his love of the written word evident in his reverent retelling. Zirath, ever the pragmatist, was the first to cut through the lingering awkwardness of Sam's literary preferences. Without preamble, he asked what the jar of eyes might look like, his tone even, as if discussing a misplaced water skin rather than a long-lost piece of an ancient mummy's anatomy. Sam perked up at the question. his scholarly instincts reigniting as he launched into a meticulous description. He detailed the jar's exact size, the faint ridges along its base, the sigils carved into its surface to signify sacred preservation, the way the material had been enchanted to resist decay. He even recalled the texture, a smooth, near-marble polish with faint grooves that helped with grip, a necessity when handling sacred organs in dimly lit tombs. The adventurers exchanged glances, impressed despite themselves. Whatever undeath had taken from Sam, his memory had remained razor-sharp. And then Zirath did something unexpected. He muttered a quiet incantation, his fingers subtly tracing the air, and before anyone could ask, his eyes glowed faintly with divination magic. The room fell silent. It wasn't the spell itself that shocked the party, it was the fact that Zirath knew it. A spell like Locate Object was extremely useful, yet in all their travels, not once had he mentioned it. No boasting, no commentary, no casual remarks about how it might have helped in past predicaments. It was a subtle reminder of just how much Zirath didn't say about himself, how many abilities he simply carried in silence until they became relevant. Friz, Thomas, Celia and Zora stared as he calmly turned his head, feeling the pull of the object in question. He could sense it. It was below them, slightly to the left. The problem? No stairs led downward. There was only a hallway to the left and a passage leading upward and to the right. Friz frowned, already contemplating how the architecture of the pyramid might explain hidden staircases. Thomas, meanwhile, made the practical suggestion of simply borrowing a map, or perhaps a guide of some sort. Sam, ever eager to help, informed them that he did in fact have a map somewhere. Unfortunately, without his eyes, he couldn't exactly find it, and if they wanted to help him look for it, he was sure it wouldn't take more than a few hundred years of careful searching. The party shifted uncomfortably, collectively deciding that they did not have that kind of time. Still, Sam's memory proved invaluable. With surprising clarity, he recounted the winding path he had taken from the tombs to the library, meticulously describing every staircase, every hallway, every turn he had wandered over the course of several centuries. Friz, delighted, eagerly wrote everything down, her quill scratching against parchment with furious precision. As they prepared to follow the path he had described, Thomas, arms folded and gaze suspicious, decided to throw one last question into the mix. "So," he asked, his voice cutting through the scholarly excitement, "were you okay with the ritual sacrifice of halflings by the hundreds?" The air in the room stopped. Friz, horrified at the timing, slapped him sharply on the shoulder, her expression a mix of alarm and exasperation. Why now? Of all times, in the undead librarian's own domain. They were trying to get his help, not interrogate him on centuries-old war crimes. Sam, however, seemed unbothered, tilting his head in thought before answering with unwavering conviction. He explained that the halflings had the honor of serving as the backbone of a great empire. A sprawling network of city-states had flourished under their labor, a civilization of over 1 million denizens, thriving under the vast aqueducts, temples, and monuments etched into eternity. Their sacrifice had built something glorious, something permanent, their deeds immortalized in the very carvings of the temples that still stood untouched by time. Zirath, listening, did not immediately disagree. From a purely arithmetical standpoint, the logic was there. Hundreds of lives, every season, traded for the prosperity of countless generations. The cold calculus of civilization, the cost of greatness. But then the thought soured in his mind, his people, his clan, had been eradicated under the same kind of reasoning. The ones who had wiped them out had likely believed in some higher vision, some greater justification, and yet all it had amounted to was ash and ruin. He forced the thought away, his focus returning to the pulse of his spell, to the object below. Celia, however, was not as restrained, her fists clenched at her sides, the sheer callousness of Sam's words igniting something deep within her. Zora, too, bristled at the explanation, his jaw tightening as his fingers flexed instinctively over the hilt of his weapon. Neither spoke, but the tension between them and the mummy was dense enough to cut with a blade. None of them said a word. Reforming the politics and moral reasoning of a 10,000-year-old mummy would, Thomas reasoned, probably take another 10,000 years. Better to move on. Friz, mustering all the politeness she could manage, quietly thanked Sam for his help, her voice strained but sincere. The others followed her lead. The mummy, ever gracious, gave them a slow bow of farewell, though he did happen to be facing the wrong direction. With nothing more to say, they turned toward the hall that would lead them deeper into the labyrinth below, leaving behind the scholar who had long since made peace with an empire they had no intention of honouring. Navigating the depths of the pyramid proved more difficult than anticipated. Zirath, focusing on the magical pulse that tugged at his senses, soon confirmed what they all suspected. The feeling of the jar was diminishing. They were going the wrong way. Or perhaps in a place like this, no way was entirely right. The labyrinth forced them back upward, and soon they stepped into a chamber that felt different from the rest. The walls, though coated in layers of dust, still bore faint hues of deep crimson, as though the stone itself had been saturated in pigment. The carvings here were bold, striking. A great red sun dominated the wall, its rays extending outward in jagged beams, commanding the space with an intensity that made the room feel smaller despite its size. Within the sun sat a massive, unblinking eye. It was all-seeing, staring down over the chamber, ever watchful. Beneath it a hand reached skyward, its fingers stretching desperately toward the celestial body above. The hand of Ozymandias, King of Kings. The symbolism was clear. Power, divinity, dominion. The grasping hand was not a plea, nor a request. It was a claim. Near the wall, standing in stark contrast to the ancient stone, a single lever protruded from the floor. Unlike the muted tones of the rest of the chamber, this one was painted a deep red, its colour vibrant even beneath the dust of ages. The party hesitated. Their minds turned back to the carvings near the entrance, the door with the sun, the fields, the waters, the sands. Perhaps this was one of the great mechanisms buried deep within the pyramid, hidden chambers housing ancient contraptions designed to control the untouched functions of the ruin. The discussion was immediate, hushed but urgent. Pulling random levers in a cursed tomb was the definition of reckless. Friz, naturally, was already considering the mechanics of it all. If the pyramid relied on sand-powered cantilevers, if the ancient architects had designed a system that functioned like the counterweights at the door, then this could be a part of it. Zora, ever straightforward, pointed out that the only way to find out was to pull it. Celia voiced her distaste for activating mysterious devices deep within a cursed labyrinth. Thomas made a casual gesture that said, well, we're already in a death trap. Might as well see what else happens. After some deliberation, they reached a reluctant consensus. With a deep breath, Zora grasped the red lever and pulled. A great groaning filled the chamber, deep and ancient, as if the very bones of the pyramid were shifting. The sound of stone grinding against stone rumbled through the walls, resonating far beyond the room itself. Somewhere in the distance, a long, drawn-out hiss followed, like air escaping from massive bellows. They waited. Nothing else stirred. The room remained unchanged. No falling ceilings, no undead guardians springing from the walls, no immediate and horrifying consequences. Deeming there was nothing left to gain here, they retraced their steps, winding back down into the depths, past the Grand Library. The blind tomekeeper, still lost in his endless vigil, remained undisturbed. His head tilted slightly as they passed, as though sensing movement, but he made no effort to engage them, and they, in turn, left him to his centuries of silent wandering. Instead, they turned toward the unexplored hall, the one leading deeper, to where the unseen mechanisms, the lost artifacts, and perhaps the jar of eyes truly lay hidden. The soft sound reached them before they saw anything, a gentle trickle, rhythmic and serene, barely audible over the shifting hush of their own footsteps. The light from the crystal prisms above cast a steady glow on the walls, guiding them deeper as they moved toward the source. As they ventured deeper, the faint murmur sharpened into the unmistakable sound of running water. Stepping into the chamber, they were greeted by the unexpected sight of a fountain, its stone basin bubbling with what appeared to be clean, fresh water. The surface rippled gently, a small stream pouring from an unseen source, crystal clear and inviting. Thomas, never one to waste time overthinking, had already taken a step forward, hand outstretched toward the pristine surface. His intent was obvious. Water meant drinking, and drinking meant survival. Before he could so much as dip a finger in, the others pulled him back. It was impossible to forget what had happened in the blasted canyons, the oasis trap, the magma fiends, the burning sand that had nearly incinerated them when they had last stumbled upon something that looked too good to be true. Zora shot him a warning glance, and Celia crossed her arms, waiting for the inevitable moment when reason would win out over impulse. Grumbling, Thomas relented, watching as Frizz and Zora began their usual assessment. They scoured the area for any signs of trickery, hidden mechanisms, subtle runes, concealed glyphs, waiting to unleash horrors upon the unwary. Nothing. No spells of illusion, no dormant traps, no unseen malice lurking beneath the surface, just the unmistakable scent of crisp, fresh water. Zora, after a moment of deliberation, scooped a handful to his lips, pausing just long enough to brace himself for the worst. The others watched, waiting. He swallowed. It was good. With that confirmation, the hesitation broke. They drank deeply, filling their water skins, savouring the refreshment in a place where such a thing had no right to exist. The realization settled in slowly. It made sense. They had only just passed the second major chamber after the entrance. The benches encircling the fountain, worn yet perfectly placed, suggested this had once been a place of respite, a resting point for those who had made the long journey to the temple. For once, it seemed, something in this place was exactly what it appeared to be. Once their thirst was slaked and supplies replenished, they pressed onward. This time, the shift in direction was unmistakable. The sloping halls carried them downward. And then, as they passed a narrowing corridor, something familiar caught their attention. One of the halls bore the same deep red hue as the chamber of the Great Sun. The walls, still marked with faint pigments, seemed to hold a presence, silent, waiting. Frizz's sharp eyes were the first to catch the detail hidden within the stone. A seam, subtle but unmistakable, ran along the wall's edge. A door had once stood here, locked, sealed. A glance was exchanged. Had they already triggered it? Had the red switch they had pulled earlier unlocked this passage as they walked through? There was no way to tell, at least not yet. But the thought lingered in each of their minds as they continued their descent, moving deeper into the unknown, following the quiet pull of a forgotten relic, and the whispering echoes of a long-buried empire. The descent continued, stone walls showcasing unnatural smoothness as though the stone itself had never known the touch of tools. The sound of their steps was soon accompanied by something else. Not by whispers of ancient spirits or distant echoes, but by a soft, rhythmic scraping. A hesitant pause, then another step forward. The room opened before them, revealing a circular chamber lined with brass and obsidian workbenches, cluttered with the detritus of long-abandoned experiments. Bubbling vials still percolated over cold, rune-etched braziers, their contents shifting in colour and viscosity as if waiting for someone to continue their work. Cauldrons bore faded inscriptions, their enchantments long since drained, while flasks of unknown substances oozed and writhed in their glass prisons. The sharp tang of burnt reagents clung to the air, mingling with the musty weight of time. Frizz's eyes widened in delighted recognition. This was a proper alchemical laboratory, a place of learning, a chamber for teaching. The rows of workbenches, positioned for students to observe and experiment, were unmistakable. She could feel the history of eager scholars taking notes, whispering incantations, getting the correct ratios almost right before suffering some minor, albeit combustive, setback. The entire space resonated with potential. But her excitement was quickly interrupted by the presence of someone new. In the far corner of the lab, another mummy stood, or rather worked, with patient, unyielding futility. Unlike Sam, the blind librarian, or the bejeweled priests carved into the temple walls, this one was wrapped hastily, its linen bindings uneven and loose. The adornments on his person were nothing more than plain tin and iron, the sort of trinkets given out of obligation rather than reverence. In his withered hands, he clutched a broom that had long since lost its bristles, yet he continued his work undeterred, pushing the worn wooden stick back and forth against the stone in a determined though entirely ineffective attempt to sweep the endless dust and sand into a small, pitiful pail on the ground. The effort was so painfully hopeless that even the dust seemed embarrassed to be there. Without stopping his efforts, he introduced himself as Anka, chief groundskeeper of the Temple of Syrinx. Though, he clarified, these days he was also the only groundskeeper. His cloth-wrapped head tilted slightly as he took in the group's unfamiliar faces and, more curiously, their unusual wrappings. His bandaged fingers flexed over the broom handle as he pondered aloud why their mummification bindings were so strange before asking quite casually what exactly had brought them to his temple. The party, already feeling the mounting absurdity of the encounter, let out a collective sigh, quickly explaining that they were explorers, seeking something buried in the depths of the temple belonging to the Mage Lord Syrinx. The reply was met with a slow nod, Anki continuing to push his non-existent broom bristles over the floor, the quiet scraping somehow making the whole thing worse. He acknowledged their presence with polite interest, but much like Sam before him, was far more interested in recounting his own story. The royal guard had come just as they had for the others, rounding up everyone in the temple. But unlike the scholars and acolytes, Anka had been thrilled. It was time, he had been told, for eternal life. The priests had reassured him that his service to Ozymandias was recognized, that his many years of cleaning and maintaining the temple would now be rewarded with a place in the afterlife. Anka had been 43 years old at the time, positively ancient for a groundskeeper, as he put it, his tone suggesting that this was, in fact, deeply impressive. He had lived a long and full life, tending to the temple halls, polishing the floors, keeping the sacred grounds pristine. He had earned this. His voice carried a wistful, almost reverent tone as he explained that he had very much been looking forward to an eternity of peace, sweeping the vast eternity of the heavens for his masters. The priests, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that his years of diligent service had made him uniquely qualified to continue his duties beyond the mortal coil. His reward for his faithful devotion was an afterlife of meticulous maintenance. Anki, for his part, did not sound bitter. However, as Sam had mentioned, Anki feared too that the rituals had been done maybe just a touch too quickly. He had awoken some thousands of years ago. A slow, creeping sense of pity overtook them, much as it had with Sam. Friz, naturally, was the first to respond, offering a sympathetic acknowledgement of his situation. She was polite about it, painfully polite. The others, however, were once again exchanging glances, silently agreeing that this was yet another tragedy that required a god's-awful amount of patience to process. Before they left, Zirath crossed his arms and regarded Anka carefully. They were there for a reason. The blasted canyons, the sand golem, and now this Temple of Syrinx. It was about the Vestran orbs, and something about this place felt unfinished, like there were layers still waiting to be uncovered. With measured calm, he asked if there was something else, something buried deeper. Anki's sweeping slowed, the lifeless bristles of his broomstick scraping the ground with a noticeably weaker stroke. After a long pause, he finally admitted that he had seen the royal guard bring something into the temple. He hadn't known what it was, only that one of the guards had carried a bundle in his hands, something wrapped tightly, something secretive. But more importantly, he did know that there was a fifth level beneath the pyramid. The moment the words left him, he froze. A visible change came over the mummy, as if he had just broken some great unspoken rule. He shifted awkwardly, his linen-wrapped form stiffening. His jaw, already slack from decay, seemed to sag just a little lower, as though he regretted the words that had slipped out. He wasn't supposed to know that. And now that he had said it, he absolutely was not going to mention it again. His broom resumed its scraping. He did not elaborate. He did not look at them. He had officially decided that, as far as he was concerned, this conversation never happened. But Frizz, ever the thinker, had an idea. Reaching into her pack, she pulled out a massive bundle of rope and held it up with a casual air, as though it were the most natural solution in the world. If Anke's bristles had long since worn away, why not make new ones? For the first time, the eternal toil of Anke, chief groundskeeper of the Temple of Syrinx, was interrupted. The mummy's head snapped toward the rope bundle with something akin to religious fervour. And then, in a display none of them had ever expected to witness in their lifetimes, the mummy jumped. A full, joyous leap into the air. The movement so precise, so perfect, that for a brief, fleeting moment, Anke was weightless. He jumped and clicked his heels together in mid-air. The amusing spectacle lasted precisely 2 seconds before he landed with an audible, bone-chilling snap emanating from his foot. The party winced. Celia immediately stepped forward, offering to help, but Anke, still standing at a slightly unnatural angle, waved her off with cheerful dismissal. It wasn't painful, he assured them, one of the perks of being long dead. So with the group still recovering from what they had just witnessed, they spent a bit of time fashioning new bristles for the ancient broom. Frizz, ever generous, offered up 50 feet of her rope for the effort. Anke beamed as much as a dried-up, linen-wrapped corpse could, judging that this supply should last him another 20,000 years. At this, he was positively gleeful. They worked together, uncoiling the rope and fashioning small braids into bristles, his excitement and anticipation palpable. He tested his new broom, brushing it across the stone floor. A hush fell over the chamber as the dust actually moved. For the first time in thousands of years, the grime of ages finally gathered into a corner instead of merely swirling aimlessly. A miracle. The group watched as he hummed to himself, twirling his newly reinforced broom between sweeps, utterly delighted by his newfound efficiency. Some among them, however, couldn't help but ponder the scale of his task. The size of the underground pyramid, the endless corridors, the shifting sands that would never stop accumulating. By the time Anke finished cleaning one side, another would have already been covered anew, forcing him to begin again. It was less a duty, more a tragic saga, the eternal toil of groundskeeper Anke. Anke, ever diligent, continued sweeping with renewed vigour, the fresh bristles of his newly restored broom making the task almost efficient. A small corner of the chamber, the same spot he had been working on for centuries, was finally free of dust. His satisfaction was nearly palpable as he paused in his work, turning his linen-wrapped head toward Frizz. There was a moment of consideration, a silence that stretched just long enough to suggest that what he was about to say was something important. Perhaps it was the rope. Perhaps it was the generosity of giving him 20,000 years of sweeping security. Whatever it was, he decided that Frizz was trustworthy. Lowering his voice, despite the fact that, as far as they could tell, there was no one else around who would care, he let her in on a secret. The staff of Syrinx was still here, buried within the temple's depths. A powerful artifact imbued with the knowledge and magic of the great mage lord himself. It was, of course, well guarded, locked behind a chamber of traps and glyphs that had been placed to ensure only the worthy could claim it. He explained the warning signs, the glyphs etched into the stone floor of the chamber, sacred symbols of the old pantheon. Isis's ankh, emblem of life and rebirth. Kepri's scarab, emblem of transformation and the rising sun. Mayat's feather, emblem of truth and balance. Horus's eye, emblem of protection and vision. These were not merely decorative. They were part of a test, a puzzle requiring the correct sequence. If stepped upon in the wrong order, the temple would unleash its fury. Anke had learned this the hard way. The first 2 times he had triggered the wrong sequence, causing an avalanche of falling sand to bury the chamber. It had taken him 200 years to clear it each time, and more tragically, he had lost all his brooms in the process. The party stood in stunned silence, absorbing the idea of this poor, cursed groundskeeper spending literal centuries shoveling sand out of a room he had no real reason to enter in the first place. Still, the information was invaluable. With careful precision, Anki described the path to the chamber where the staff lay entombed. Frizz, quill already in hand, noted the way. By the time they finally left Anki to his sweeping, they walked away with not just one, but 3 goals now set before them. The eyes of Sam, the lost relic of the blind librarian. The staff of the mage lord Syrinx, hidden behind a deadly puzzle. And the mystery of the secret vault buried beneath the temple's foundations. As they descended once more, leaving behind the rhythmic sweeping of the eternally devoted Anki, Thomas felt something shift, not in the air around him, but in the space within his mind where his patron's presence lurked. It was subtle at first, a flicker of awareness that did not carry the weight of fear as it had in the dead law, nor the gnawing obligation that came with preparing for a heist. This was something different, a slow, deliberate stirring, anticipation. Baba Yaga was watching. The realization sent an uneasy shiver through him, but he kept it to himself. Now was not the time for distractions. Whatever she was waiting for, whatever had drawn her attention to the depths of this temple, he would find out soon enough. For now they continued downward, stepping deeper into the bones of a lost empire, toward the secrets that time had tried to bury, and the dangers that had been left behind to guard them. As they pressed forward, Zirath, who had remained focused on the locate object spell, suddenly felt the pull strengthen, the sensation sharpening with certainty. They were very close now. The eyes of Sam were near, waiting somewhere just ahead. The corridor opened into a chamber of quiet reverence and forgotten devotion. Lining the cold stone walls, rows of ornately carved sarcophagi stood in solemn formation, each marked with sigils denoting the mage lord's most loyal followers. As they moved through the chamber, another unsettling detail emerged. Some of the sarcophagi, particularly those nearest the open tombs, bore dark, aged stains at their bases, bloodstains, long dried but unmistakable even under the dim, ghostly light. The implications were immediate, heavy, and grim. Scattered around the cracked sarcophagi, strips of linen wrappings lay abandoned, some still stiff with what could have been resin or preservation oils, others tattered as if the process had been hurried, incomplete, due to the panic of the uprising that Sam had mentioned. And some of the dead, like Sam the librarian and Anki the groundskeeper, had not stayed where they were put following the hurried rites imposed by the royal guards. Above each of the sarcophagi, shelves had been built into the walls, lined with delicate jars that fit the precise description Sam had given. The careful organization suggested they were ritual vessels, placed in honor above the tombs of their former owners. It was a meticulous arrangement, one that unfortunately had been slightly disrupted. Frizz was the first to notice it. One jar had fallen, landing behind one of the massive stone tombs, tucked just out of reach. Dust had settled around it, undisturbed for what must have been centuries. After a bit of effort, they retrieved the lost jar and carefully unsealed it. Inside, resting atop dried preservation salts, 2 withered eyeballs lay undisturbed, their shriveled forms still perfectly intact. The eyes of Sam. They had what they needed, but their attention drifted toward the still-sealed sarcophagi. It was the kind of temptation that whispered to every adventurer, the unknown, the possibility of lost relics, of secrets buried with the dead. Who were these devoted followers? What treasures, what knowledge had been sealed away with them? 2 had been cracked open, their interiors empty, their former occupants now performing eternal duties. They stood in silence, debating without words. Then, almost as one, they took a collective step back. 2 friendly mummies in a single expedition was already incredible luck. Testing their fortune any further seemed like an invitation for disaster. Best not to poke at what was meant to stay buried. Turning toward the 2 passages leading out of the chamber, they considered their path forward. One led up and to the right, an incline that might take them toward another level of the temple. The other led straight left, keeping them on the current floor. They chose the left. For once, the path ahead led exactly where it should have, instead of twisting in nonsensical loops or leading them back to where they started. The hall stretched forward in a rare display of logic, and though none of them said it outright, they all took a moment to appreciate the absence of another disorienting maze. The locate object spell had done its job well. Zirath, as satisfied as he ever got, which was to say barely at all, gave a slight nod, the closest he would come to openly acknowledging success. The chamber before them was a masterwork of stonecraft, its walls and ceiling carved with a precision that transformed cold, dead rock into something alive. Though solid stone, the surfaces mimicked the rugged cliffs and jagged rock formations of the surrounding desert, as if the canyon walls had continued their journey underground. Soft, ambient light, its source unseen, shifted along the carvings, casting shadows that mimicked the sun's slow march across the sky. But it was the floor that truly set them on edge. Beneath their feet lay a painstakingly detailed three-dimensional representation of the very blasted canyons they had braved before reaching the pyramid. Every path, every ridge, every winding, suffocating passage had been perfectly recreated in miniature, stretching from one door to the next in an unsettling display of craftsmanship. Some depressions ran deep, falling to waist height, while others jutted upward into jagged stone impasses. Thomas stood at the edge, looking down at the twisting paths they had barely survived in the previous week, and exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Metaphorically, having to walk through the canyons again just to move forward was almost too on the nose, and if they hesitated, this was a trap. That much was clear, but how? Frizz, sharp as ever, recalled the stories, and what Zora had said about whalebones at the cavern of the shaman. The canyons had once flowed with water before the desert took them. With an almost casual air, she unfastened a waterskin, tilting it over the carved channels. The first few drops vanished into the crevices of the stone. Then the water hit the lowest points of the miniature canyon floor. The entire room reacted instantly. The air shifted, a deep heat rolling through the chamber like the first exhale of a furnace, heavy and wrong. Sand poured from unseen slits in the walls, flooding the canyon channels, but instead of pooling into dunes, it met the water, fusing together in a blinding flare of molten glass. The heat was immediate, violent, a sudden inferno that sent shimmering waves of distortion into the air. Had they stepped in first, their bodies would have been incinerated before they had time to react. A collective moment of appreciation for Frizz's instincts swept through the group. The next debate was less satisfying. They still had rope, a lot of rope, and now the quiet genius of Frizz's relentless preparedness over the past few weeks was finally sinking in. Unfortunately, there was nothing to lash it to. Celia, weighing their options, offered an alternative. Her Aasimar blood allowed her to summon celestial wings, but only for a short time. She could fly across, scout ahead, and find something to secure for the others. She had no fear of going alone. Zirath seemed to agree, putting trust in her strength and skill. The rest of the group, however, was deeply against the idea. After a round of discussion, they agreed this path wasn't worth it. If there was an easier way, they would take it. Turning back, they retraced their steps, past the sarcophagi, past the lingering air of something watching, and up the path they had previously ignored. The new chamber was yet another monument to Ozymandias, King of Kings, carved with the same obsessive devotion seen throughout the temple. But this time, the story had details they had not yet encountered. Long before empires had risen, before the desert had claimed the land, the canyons stretched endless and barren, untouched by time. Then, a wandering tribal leader, seeking shelter in the twisting rock formations, stumbled upon something older than the sands themselves, a crystalline orb, pulsing with eerie ancient power. With it he became Ozymandias, his dominion unmatched. The carvings showed Ozymandias standing behind the mage lord Syrinx, a shrouded figure who loomed over 100 headless servants, their identities erased, their stature smaller than the others. Slaves, their souls bound to him, their sacrifices fueling something greater. Under the rule of the King of Kings, the dry canyons flourished. The power of the orb called forth waters, transforming the arid wasteland into an oasis, a kingdom pulled from death itself. Thus, the forgotten desert was tamed, and his reign became eternal, etched into the very walls of the pyramid. The red-bricked city-states of Ozymandian Empire had been razed by the halflings. The party took it all in, studying the carvings for anything useful. It was Zora who noticed it first, and the orb, carved at the heart of the story, wasn't just stone. It had seams. Without hesitation, he reached up and pushed it. A dull click echoed through the chamber. A soft rumble followed as an unseen mechanism released, and a portion of the wall slid open, revealing a new passageway, one leading straight and to the right. It didn't take them long to realize what they had found. This corridor, if their understanding was correct, would take them above the chamber now filled with molten glass. It was a way forward. Zora stepped back, arms crossed with the mildest hint of satisfaction. He hadn't been sure it would work, but fortune had favored the bold. With one last glance at the carving of the orb that changed the world, they turned, stepping into the newly revealed passage, continuing deeper into the tomb, into the secrets of the temple, and toward whatever waited beyond the reach of history. The passage led them as expected over the carved map room of the blasted canyons, where they emerged into a vast crypt-like chamber, its stillness so profound that even their breaths felt intrusive. The grand sarcophagus of the Mage Lord dominated the space, an imposing monolith of black marble, its surface encrusted with runes of protection that pulsed faintly beneath the eerie blue glow cast by the temple's sun lenses. Towering statues of hooded sentinels stood along the walls, their presence silent yet watchful, their unyielding gaze seeming to weigh the worth of all who entered. Everything in the chamber bore the same blue hue, not just the filtered light, but also the carvings at the base of the walls, which depicted flowing waters, a testament to the ancient kingdom that had once flourished before the desert reclaimed it. There was a strange serenity to the place, as though the memory of the lost oasis still clung to its stone. Yet as their gazes fell upon the floor, the mood shifted from reverence to unease. The tiles beneath their feet bore symbols they recognized immediately. Isis's ankh, Khipri's scarab, Mahat's feather, Horus's eye. The group halted in unison, knowing full well that a misstep here would be catastrophic. For once, there was no need for an extended debate. They were very fortunate to have spoken with Anka. With measured patience, Friz stepped forward, carefully following the correct sequence, her mind recalling every detail the groundskeeper had shared. Each footfall landed precisely where it needed to, though the vast slits in the ceiling did little to calm her nerves. The sheer size of the room, combined with the ominous mechanisms overhead, suggested that if the wrong sigil had been pressed, the entire chamber would have become a giant tomb of cascading sand. And with that realization, an uncomfortable thought crept into their minds. Anka had emptied this chamber of sand. Twice. The image of the ever-diligent mummy, painstakingly clearing away what must have been an ocean of dust and debris with his useless, bristleless broom, was both deeply tragic and undeniably absurd. By the time Friz reached the sarcophagus and placed her foot upon the final correct pressure plate, a deep, mechanical click echoed through the chamber. The group collectively braced themselves. Slowly, Friz lifted the lid of the great tomb. Inside there was no body, no ancient withered remains of the Syrinx, the Mage Lord, no horrifying revenant waiting to lunge from the darkness. Instead, resting in solemn reverence where a ruler's corpse should have been, lay a magnificent staff, its polished length adorned with arcane sigils, its form radiating an unmistakable energy. The staff of Syrinx. Friz reached for it, and the moment her fingers wrapped around its shaft, magic surged through her. The sensation was immediate, potent, sharp and intoxicating in its depth. This was no ordinary relic, nor was it simply an ornamental symbol of power. It was an arcane focus of immense potential, a conduit through which spells could be shaped and amplified beyond what ordinary magic could achieve. It was an item of legend. But as she held it, weighing its significance, another thought lingered at the edges of her mind. She knew dark magic. She had studied its intricacies, understood its allure and its dangers. She had walked the line between knowledge and power, never ignorant of what such artifacts could become in the wrong hands. The Pact of Mystra, the very foundation of her beliefs, had been forged to prevent magic from falling into corruption. This staff had once belonged to a mage lord of an empire built on blood and sacrifice. But that was not how it would be wielded now. She would master it, she would use it, and she would ensure that its power served something greater than the ambition that had created it. It would be a tool of balance, of Mystra's light, of her own will. And as she exhaled, feeling the weight of its history settle into her grasp, she knew that she would not let the past dictate the future of what she had claimed. As Celia scanned the chamber, her keen eyes traced the hooded black statues, their silent presence standing as eternal sentinels over the mage lord's resting place. Their forms, carved with meticulous precision, were angled not aimlessly but with purpose, all facing the same direction as though observing something unseen. Following their gaze, she spotted it, a blue lever tucked away within the stonework, nearly imperceptible against the chamber's dim lighting. Without hesitation, she turned to the others, her expression questioning but determined. A silent exchange passed between them, nods of approval, an unspoken agreement. With a steady hand, Celia pulled the lever. The now familiar groan of shifting stone filled the chamber, deep and reverberating, as though the very bones of the pyramid were shifting in acknowledgement. But as before, the room remained unchanged. No doors slid open, no walls retracted, no grand reveals. And yet they knew something had moved. Somewhere. Thus far, every lever, switch, and hidden mechanism they had uncovered had been carefully placed, deliberately concealed. Each a key designed to manipulate something greater within the temple's vast and intricate network. Anticipation grew within them, a silent electric energy, as they turned back toward the passage leading to the hall of Ozymandias's story. Whatever this puzzle had been, whatever unseen mechanism had now been set into motion, they were close to understanding exactly what it had unlocked. The party retraced their steps, moving once more through the secret passage they had uncovered, past the great stone-carved history of Ozymandias. The tale of the King of Kings remained unchanged, frozen in its eternal retelling, yet the adventurers now saw it with fresh eyes. Their path led them upward through a winding hallway, its ascent gradual but deliberate, as if guiding them towards something long forgotten. As they climbed, they came upon a staircase of deep blue stone, its surface carved to mimic the flowing currents of water, a visual echo of the once thriving rivers that had sustained this kingdom. They paused, recognizing the significance of what lay before them. Had they not activated the blue switch, this path would have remained sealed, impassable. A moment of reflection passed between them. How many of these paths had only revealed themselves through chance? How many hidden choices had they stumbled upon that had quietly altered their fate? Had it been luck? Or was there something unseen guiding them through the temple's layers? Such questions had no answers. Only the all-knowing gods could say for certain. At the summit of the winding corridor, the great likeness of Ozymandias loomed before them, carved into the stone wall, his figure etched with the authority of a king who ruled as though his dominion was eternal. But it was what stood beside him that seized their attention. A map of the southern continent, its lands carved in extraordinary detail, stretched across the chamber's walls. Rivers, mountains, and coastal cities were depicted in careful relief, marking a land that had once flourished under the king's reign. It was Friz who made the connection first. She traced her fingers over the engraved rivers, her mind piecing together the fragments of history. These were the blasted canyons, before they had become ruins, before the land had turned to dust and stone. City-states dotted the landscape, remnants of an empire that had once thrived. but two landmarks stood out among the others. The Temple of Ozymandias, the royal treasury, and the Temple of Syrinx, inside which the adventurers now stood. She traced the engraved rivers and city-states with careful intent, her analytical mind already piecing together the puzzle. With the known location of the blasted canyons and the fallen statue of Ozymandias as fixed points, she could triangulate the whereabouts of the Tomb of Ozymandias and the royal treasury. The realization settled quickly. If her calculations were correct, they wouldn't just be navigating blindly. They now had a map to history's lost remains. Zirath and Thomas very much liked the idea of raiding a royal treasury. As she sketched a rough interpretation into her notes, the others examined the walls of the chamber, their eyes drawn to something new, a depiction of green fields and a vast oasis, carved in vibrant contrast to the harsh deserts they had encountered elsewhere. The motif had repeated itself enough times now that suspicion rose quickly among them. They searched and they found it. A stone palm leaf, inconspicuously placed at the base of the oasis relief, was not like the rest. Zora tested it, pressing carefully. It turned. The temple groaned once more, the now familiar sound of ancient mechanisms shifting somewhere in the depths below. But this time a second, more local response was immediate. Unlike before, where they had only heard movement elsewhere, one of the chamber walls twisted before their very eyes, revealing a new passage, its entrance dark and spiralling downward. The party gathered at the precipice, peering down into the void below. This descent was different from the others, deeper, darker, more foreboding. Thomas exhaled, adjusting his coat, his hand instinctively brushing against the artifacts he carried. Zirath tightened his grip on his axe, the weight of responsibility heavy in his stance. Celia cracked her knuckles, glancing at her companions with an unspoken readiness. Friz adjusted her notes, her fingers still tingling from the staff of Syrinx, its presence like an ember of power in her grasp. Zora, ever fearless, took the first step forward, the spiral swallowing him in shadow. One by one they followed downward, ever downward. This descent felt different, not just another chamber, not just another puzzle, but something deeper, something that had remained sealed away for a reason. Whatever lay at the end of this spiral, it was waiting. At the base of the long, spiraling descent, the stone gave way to an audience chamber of immense scale. The air was heavier here, charged with an almost tangible presence, as though the weight of centuries pressed against the walls. Towering statues of scholars and sorcerers lined the grand hall, each seated in an eternal state of contemplation, their carved expressions locked in solemn thought. Their presence was overwhelming, each figure carved with such precision that for a fleeting moment they appeared alive, as if the learned dead still presided over the hall's affairs. At the far end, a raised obsidian platform loomed above the chamber, serving as a lectern from which the Mage Lord Syrinx himself had once delivered his teachings. Though the chamber had long been abandoned, echoes of its purpose remained. Faint illusions flickered intermittently in the air, revealing glimpses of past lectures, the spectral remnants of knowledge passed down through generations. At first, the whispers were indistinct, no different than the hiss of shifting sands. But as they listened more closely, the illusion peeled away, revealing words woven into the air like an ancient ritual, continuing long after the scholars had turned to dust. Celia turned to speak, her lips parting to voice a thought. But before she could, Thomas raised a hand, a single finger pressed to his lips, his expression sharp with warning. They froze, the silence stretching long and suffocating. In that stillness, Thomas's urgency became clear. What had first seemed like the hiss of shifting sand revealed itself as something far more unnerving. Whispers, soft yet deliberate, echoing through the stone. The words, though faint, carried unmistakable authority. The audience in the hall is to remain silent at all times. It was not a request, it was a direct and clear command. No punishment was mentioned, no warning explicitly given, yet the weight of the order was absolute. The unspoken threat hung in the air, and none among them dared to test the consequences of disobedience. Wordlessly they pressed forward, careful not to let even the scrape of a boot or the rustle of fabric break the stillness. The statue of Syrinx, its chiseled gaze severe and unrelenting, loomed over them, watching their every move. It was a relief to pass beneath its shadow without a sound, to feel its judgment, but not its wrath. At the far end of the chamber, a long hallway stretched ahead, straight, distant, vanishing into the unknown. Without a word, they moved toward it, stepping away from the silent watchers of the past, deeper into the temple's last secrets. Beyond the audience hall, the private chamber of Mage Lord Syrinx stood in stark contrast to the temple's grand halls. Though modest in size, it radiated intimate opulence, a place of quiet contemplation, where the air itself seemed to hum with centuries of woven magic. A low-cushioned divan of crimson silk, framed in lapis lazuli and ivory, rested against one wall, while beneath it, a hand-woven rug of indigo and gold depicted celestial constellations and the long-lost rivers of the desert kingdom. At the room's heart, a sandalwood writing desk bore the sigil of Ozymandias, its surface covered with aged parchment, obsidian inkpots, and quills from desert falcons. A half-written tome, its ink still dark, lay untouched by time, while a golden astrolabe sat nearby, its delicate arms frozen, tracking celestial bodies long forgotten. Along the bronze shelves, rare manuscripts and enchanted texts lay embroidered with protective glyphs, while small terracotta jars housed saffron, powdered carnelian, and lotus resin, remnants of arcane study. In the corner, an ornate brass basin sat upon a marble pedestal, once used for ritual purification. The water had long since evaporated, leaving behind only the faint trace of its sacred purpose. The silk tapestry hung against the stone wall, its deep indigo background woven with silver and gold threads, creating the illusion of a night sky frozen in time. The fabric was impossibly fine, the kind spun only for kings and scholars, its edges lined with intricate geometric borders that framed the celestial scene within. Two bird-shaped constellations soared across the heavens, their wings outstretched as if to embrace the vastness of the cosmic expanse. The first, a great majestic bird, stretched across the upper half of the tapestry, its wings woven in shimmering gold, each feather stitched with reverence. Inside its left wing, the symbol of Isis's ankh glowed in golden embroidery, the emblem of life and rebirth, an eternal cycle that even the sands of time could not erase. In the right wing, Khepri's scarab was embedded in intricate threadwork, its form carrying the emblem of transformation and the rising sun, a reminder of the rebirth of kingdoms and the shifting fate of the world. Below, the second bird, an owl with piercing eyes, was no less striking. Its dark silver form, woven in metallic thread, stretched its wings outward, as though casting its watchful gaze over the desert empire below. One wing bore Mayat's feather, the symbol of truth and balance, unwavering in its judgment. The other held Horus's eye, the sigil of protection and vision, its presence promising clarity to those who sought the path of wisdom. As Frizz's fingers traced the patterns, her mind swirled with thoughts half-formed, knowledge felt but not yet understood. These images, these symbols, had appeared too many times now, on walls, on relics, on the very trials they had faced in the temple's depths. It all meant something, a pattern she had yet to unravel. As the others sifted through the relics of the chamber, she sat on a stone ledge, scribbling frantically in her notebook, sketching the tapestry in perfect detail, determined to piece together the puzzle. Elsewhere in the chamber, Celia, combing through alchemy tables and herbology cabinets, uncovered something far more tangible. Amid the crumbling scrolls and aged vials, she found dried botanical components, their scents potent and sharp, the kind of ingredients that only dessert alchemists could cultivate. She recognized them instantly. These were rare blooms, ingredients used in the brewing of a potion of supreme healing. It would take time, the mixture would need to ferment properly, but she was confident in her ability to craft it. A small victory, but one that could mean the difference between life and death in the trials to come. As the others busied themselves with their own discoveries, Frizz's hands drifted over the private collection of books, the ancient tomes resting on finely crafted wooden shelves, untouched for centuries. Most were volumes of arcane philosophy, astronomical charts, or meditations on the balance of power and magic. But her fingers halted over a particular tome, its leather-bound cover cracked with age, yet still pulsing with an unsettling presence. The title, scrawled in dark curling script, sent an immediate chill down her spine. The blood rites of the Mage Lord Syrinx. Frizz's stomach turned as she cracked open the brittle pages, their whispers carrying secrets best left buried. The ink, unnervingly dark, described the ritual sacrifice of halflings, not as mere offerings but as fuel, their essence extracted to power a magnificent orb. The draconic army had not sought another mere weapon. They had hunted a second orb, a means to bind more souls, to expand their dominion, to wield the same forbidden magic that had built an empire from sand and suffering. With a single Orb of Vestra, he had tamed the desert, summoned rivers, and built a paradise where only dust had ruled. But this was no divine miracle. The oasis had been forged in suffering, sustained by blood rites, the lives of thousands of enslaved souls consumed to maintain his dominion. And now in her hands lay the instructions to do it all again. Maestra, or her dark reflection as the Flayer, had been right. Frizz would see that this tome would someday, hopefully soon, find its way to the Deadlaw. As Celia and Frizz worked, Xerath's gaze had drifted downward. Something about the floor unsettled him. The way the stone beneath the dust felt different. He knelt, wiping away centuries of filth not yet attended by Anki, revealing hand-carved patterns beneath the ochre dust. Unlike the rigid geometry of the temple's walls, these markings flowed like waves, mimicking the shifting sands of the desert. And at the center of the carvings, set flush into the stone, was the final switch, a pressure plate, carved in yellow ochre, the last piece of the puzzle. A final discussion was exchanged. A group nod. With deliberate weight, Xerath pressed down on the plate. The chamber groaned in response, the ancient mechanisms buried deep within the temple shifting with a force that sent tremors through the stone beneath their feet. But this time, the reaction was greater than before. Somewhere above them, something enormous was moving, a shift so profound that they could feel it even at these forgotten depths. There was nothing left to uncover. Every hall, every corridor, every secret hidden within the twisting depths of the Temple of Syrinx had been scoured. The temple had yielded its knowledge, its treasures, its ancient warnings. It was time to return to the great slab door at the temple's entrance. Retracing their steps, they moved silently through the audience hall, where the spectral murmurs of ancient lectures still drifted through the vast space. The whispers pressed at their ears, a faint insistence that someone was always watching, always listening, but they obeyed the unspoken command. Not a single word was spoken, not a single step misplaced. Past the great carved vanity of Ozymandias, they walked once more through the story of his ascension, his rule built upon ambition and sacrifice, upon the lives of those whose names were never etched in stone. The reality of the blood rites made it all the more unbearable, the grandeur now nothing more than a monument to unspeakable cruelty. When they finally reached the temple's sweeping grounds, their solemn reflection was immediately derailed by the sight of Anke, still sweeping, still whistling, as though his thousands of years of custodial duty had been uninterrupted by the temple literally shifting beneath them. The new bristles they had given him had clearly changed his entire existence. He was positively thriving, effortlessly gathering dust into perfectly neat piles for the first time in recorded history. His broom twirled expertly between sweeping strokes, his whistled tune cheerful as he worked without a care in the world. He cheerfully nodded as they passed, lost in what was undoubtedly the highlight of his eternal afterlife. As the party turned to leave, Anki's friendly voice called out, stopping them cold. Had they by any chance seen his pet golem at the entrance? A long, tense silence followed. Thomas, ever the fastest liar, recovered first, nodding with unsettling enthusiasm. Oh yes, the golem was just fine. In great shape, really. And then he shut up, because if he said anything more he might have had to explain that the just fine golem had actually tried to pulverize them into a fine paste, nearly crushed Thomas into an abstract smear, and was now an aesthetically pleasing pile of rubble in the courtyard. Anka sighed in relief. He had been so worried. The golem was such a good helper, strong enough to move statues so Anki could sweep under them properly. Without him the courtyard would be a right mess. The party, each carrying their own special brand of guilt, nodded solemnly. Anka then mentioned how the golem loved music and that a certain tune always made him lay down and take a nap. The entire party memorized that tune on the spot as if their very survival depended on it. The party shared a look, a rare silent agreement that for all the horrors they had uncovered, at least one soul in this cursed tomb was completely content. Moving past, they followed the twisting paths once more, past the long-dried oasis, past the corridors filled with the monuments of vanity, and down toward the grand library, where another eternal soul awaited them. There, as expected, Sam was still wandering aimlessly, his fingers trailing along forgotten scrolls, his sightless gaze cast across the invisible maze of knowledge he had long since memorized, but could never read. Zirith stepped forward, holding the small preserve jar containing the eyes of Sam, and gently placed them into the mummy's outstretched hands. A pause, and then, with absolute precision, Sam popped them into his empty sockets with ease, blinked once, and immediately recoiled at the sight before him. For the first time in thousands of years he saw someone else. And he was deeply confused, and with a frown his newly restored gaze scanned the strangely dressed group, his head tilting ever so slightly. With genuine curiosity, he noted that they were certainly not wearing the appropriate mummy wrappings, and inquired if there had been some major shift in burial fashion in the last few millennia. The adventurers exchanged glances before offering vague, non-committal nods, unwilling to delve into the complex logistics of modern wardrobe choices. Oblivious to their discomfort, Sam beamed, thanking them profusely, before declaring his intent to spend the rest of eternity rereading his favourite poetry, specifically the tragic aforementioned love saga. The group forced polite smiles, nodding stiffly as they endured his heartfelt appreciation for what was undoubtedly the least valuable text in the entire Grand Library. But before they could leave, Sam's expression shifted, as though remembering something important. With sudden enthusiasm, he reached inside his tattered robes, retrieving a small cloth pouch, and held it out toward Zirith. Curious, the paladin accepted it, pulling open the drawstring. Inside were more eyes, a lot more eyes. Before anyone could ask why Sam had so many extra eyeballs, he casually explained that these had belonged to the other mummies, eyes that hadn't worked for him, but had, through centuries of trial and error, been repurposed into something useful. Zirith, now holding a handful of ancient enchanted eyeballs, stared blankly as Sam excitedly explained their new function. These were now eyes of Horus, imbued with magic that granted the user a single window through solid objects. Zirith took a long moment to process this information, slowly returning the pouch to his belt, already wondering if he would ever feel comfortable actually using them. Still, they would be useful. With no further questions, and with Sam now fully reinvested in his literary pursuits, the party turned away from the library, leaving him behind without a final goodbye. There was nothing left for them here. Their path now led back up to the main hall, to the final door, to whatever lay beyond the threshold. The ancient staircase stretched downward into the depths. Each step worn smooth by the passage of time, Thomas could feel something like static beneath his skin, a sensation both foreign and familiar. Baba Yaga yearned within him, a predator poised at the edge of revelation, her presence thick with anticipation. Zirith moved with measured steps, his expression unreadable, but within, his heart pounded with the force of a decade of searching. 10 years of wandering, fighting, questioning, all culminating here. The orb was tied to everything, the disappearance of his tribe, the oath he had sworn upon their loss, the vengeance he had carved into his very existence. And now, as the shadows deepened, that truth was within reach. Silence ruled their descent. They had braved ruins, battled sandstorms, and deciphered the cryptic remains of an empire lost to time. But this was something different. This was the end of the road, or perhaps the beginning of something far worse. At last, they stepped into the secret vault, spanning the combined size of the pyramid's base. At its center, towering over them like a god long abandoned, sat the statue of Ozymandias, King of Kings, carved from black stone. The colossus reclined on its throne, one hand resting on the armrest, the other extended outward as though in offering or command. And there, beneath its gaze, atop a silk-wrapped pedestal, lay the orb. The crystal pulsed with an inner glow, casting pale reflections across the chamber walls. It was made of the same material Zirath now carried, an Orb of Vestra, humming with a resonance older than the empire that had locked it away. This was no mere artifact. This was power incarnate, hurriedly sealed away by the royal guard in the empire's final crumbling days. Thomas took a step forward, and Baba Yaga's anticipation sharpened, her presence twisting through him with a hunger he had never felt so acutely before. Zirath clenched his fists. He was so close. Every fibre of his being screamed for him to seize it, to claim the knowledge that had eluded him for so long. The others shifted behind them, their own unease evident. Frizz thought back to the dead law, what they had learned of the orbs, and their dark potential. Celia's stance was poised, wary, as though sensing something unseen. Zora's grip tightened on his sword. He trusted his instincts, and right now, every instinct screamed that something was waiting. Zirath stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. The others followed in silence, knowing this was his moment, the culmination of years of searching, fighting, enduring. The orb pulsed, its eerie glow illuminating the chamber, casting long shadows that seemed to shift with unseen movement. They could all feel it, a power ancient and untamed, waiting to be grasped. Zirath reached out. The instant his hand made contact, his mind was no longer his own. Visions crashed into him like a tidal wave. Dark rituals, blood rites performed in the name of forgotten gods and long-fallen empires, each one a sacrificial key to the power bound within the orb. 100 rituals, 1,000 lives, a history written in blood. The time of legends unfolded before him. He forced his mind to focus, his oath, his purpose anchoring him against the flood. He wanted to see, and then he saw. A great red dragon, its massive form bound in chains of silver and gold, its fury caged but not extinguished. His people's guardian, their protector, enslaved. The scene shifted. His clan, his family, warriors and elders, cut down where they stood. The air was ripe with the scent of ash and blood, the cries of his people lost beneath the battle shouts of their conquerors. The knights, the warriors, clad in gleaming armour, their cloaks red as fresh spilled blood. Upon them, on banners and surcoats alike, a black fang stretched across the crimson field. They had come for the orb. They had come for the elder in the village, willing to kill for what he knew. The vision shifted once more. Ships, their sails stretched taut against the wind, cutting west across the ocean. Not the ship that had brought him to these lands. These were others. He did not know what it meant. Suddenly he was back. The cavern snapped into focus, the shape of the orb solid in his palm. The silence around him made him uncomfortable. Everyone was staring. Zirath's face hardened, masking the momentary disorientation behind a snort of annoyance, shaking off the unwanted attention. Without a word, he handed the orb to Thomas. The warlock's fingers tightened around it, but his usual calm assurance was gone. His face was pale, the pressure of something unsaid settling over him like a shadow. The moment Thomas grasped the orb, his body tensed as though it might snap from an invisible pressure. The others watched him with wary, expectant gazes, but within him a terrible stillness took hold. The orb was cold, unnaturally so, pressing against his palm like a piece of reality that did not belong. And then nothing. No surge of power. No searing visions. Just cold silence. He had half expected to burst into flames or have his world suddenly turn black. Instead, just the feeling of a glass ball in his hands. The others stared at Thomas, their expressions caught somewhere between terror and disbelief. None of them spoke, but the way their hands hovered near weapons, the way Celia took a slow, instinctive step back, told him something was very wrong. His breath hitched. Why were they looking at him like that? Looking around, he saw it. Darkness, thick and oily, curled from his skin like living smoke, unfurling in slow, twisting tendrils. The black swirls pulsed and shifted, not dissipating into the air, but moving with purpose, slithering away from him like something being pulled loose. And then he felt it, his pact magic surging through his veins, not at his command, but as if something else was using it. His very essence shifted, something within him unraveling, forming, reaching outward. It was leaving him, but not to free him, and it was becoming something else. Darkness gathered. The air thickened, shadows curling at the edges of the chamber, moving like liquid ink to the domed ceiling above. The very stone warped and swirled, the architecture twisting, as though reality itself was being peeled back. From the black void above, a great wooden cabin emerged, tumbling downward in an unnatural, weightless descent. Before it touched the ground, enormous gnarled chicken legs snapped outward, catching its weight with grotesque ease. The hut of Baba Yaga had landed. A single breathless moment passed before the cabin shifted, its avian limbs settling like an ancient beast preparing to feast. With a sickening creak, the wooden planks groaned, and from its threshold a staircase unfurled, not like crafted steps, but like a bony spine, stretching downward with slow, pained movements, as if the very act of forming was suffering incarnate. The adventurers stood frozen, every muscle locked in place, but not from fear alone. The air pressed against them, thick with presence, suffocating in its enormity. And then she came. From the darkened doorway, Baba Yaga emerged. The Queen of Hags, the eldest of the Fae, the nightmare of the forgotten, stepped forward with measured, deliberate movements, like a being for whom time had lost all meaning. She did not rush, nor did she so much as glance in their direction. Her steps, slow and deliberate, carried the unsettling rhythm of something ancient, swaying left and right like a crooked crone long accustomed to the weight of time. Her gnarled hands hung idly at her sides, their claw-like fingers shifting ever so slightly, as though brushing against the fabric of something unseen. Beneath the layers of shadow and age, her expression remained unknowable, unreadable, beyond comprehension. They were nothing to her, not threats, not guests, not even curiosities, just fleeting things, insignificant in the wake of something far greater. She came to a stop before them, her head tilting ever so slightly as she regarded Thomas, her gaze cold, vast, and suffocating in its expectation. Without a word, she lifted her hand, fingers curling ever so slightly, not as a request but as a silent, absolute command. The moment stretched, heavy and unrelenting, pressing down on them like a weight they could neither see nor escape. No one moved. No one even dared to breathe. And then, against all reason, against every instinct screaming for silence, Friz spoke. Friz's voice, steady and measured, cut through the suffocating quiet, but the weight of her words settled like a leaden force in the air around them. She did not challenge, did not demand, only offered. An alternative, a bargain. Not the orb Baba Yaga had extended her hand for, but another, the broken one, the shattered remnants they had carried with them long before this moment. A chill slithered through the space between them, an unseen force twisting at the edges of perception. Baba Yaga's head snapped toward the wizard, her movement sudden, unnatural, a grotesque marionette responding to a string only she could feel. Her blackened nails flexed, curling in the air, as if already closing around Frizz's throat, deciding whether this moment was worth her attention or simply something to be snuffed out. For one agonizing heartbeat, the Archfey only stared, eyes boring into Frizz. And then, suddenly, she smiled. It was not warmth nor amusement, but something worse. Her lips curled, stretching unnervingly, hovering somewhere between mockery and menace, as though she had been handed a gift she had not expected but very much enjoyed receiving. Her eyes closed, her head tilting ever so slightly, the slow nod she gave both indulgent and deeply, deeply wrong. What game she was playing, what impossible scheme had just shifted in her favour, none of them could tell. Zirath, who had never shown fear, not once, stood rigid. If anything had ever come close to looking like fear on his face, Zora noted grimly, this might be it. There was a stiffness to his movements, a hesitation that felt alien to the Dragonborn. Still, he obeyed. From his pack, Zirath pulled forth the broken pieces of the shattered orb, remnants from the Green Knight's twisted game. They glinted faintly in the dim light as he handed them to Baba Yaga. She took them with deliberate slowness, clicking the fragments together like puzzle pieces. A hush fell over the chamber, the very air growing heavy, almost suffocating, as she closed her eyes and began to draw upon the power of the intact orb. The reaction was immediate. Sickly tendrils of magic unfurled from the intact orb, latching onto the broken one like hungry leeches, gnawing at the fabric of reality itself. The seams vanished, the cracks sealing themselves, the fragments binding as though they had never been apart. The broken orb was whole again. Baba Yaga exhaled, slow and indulgent, as if savouring a victory known only to her. The newly restored orb gleamed in her palm, whole once more. Whatever satisfaction she found in this moment, it was hers alone. She did not speak, did not acknowledge them. They were nothing, fleeting things beneath her notice. Without hesitation she turned, her gait slow, swaying, unhurried by the consequence of time. The grotesque, spine-like staircase creaked beneath her, each step echoing like the last breath of something dying. For a heartbeat it felt final. Then Thomas moved toward his patron. His body fought against each step, his breath unsteady, but he forced himself forward. He had to ask. His pact, his family's curse, the weight that had shaped his entire existence. He barely drew breath before she snapped her fingers. And it was gone. The dread, the burden, the constant pull of something greater than himself, lifted as though it had never existed. He gasped, staggering under the sudden lightness, intoxicated by the sensation of freedom. However, something colder and empty settled in. Not magic, but absence, a hollow, aching void where power had once surged. He felt naked, exposed, vulnerable, no longer bound, but no longer armed. His family's curse was broken, but so was his pact magic. The relief and newfound emptiness collided, disorienting him, leaving him in a state of strange, awful balance. If he had wanted this, then why did he feel like he had lost something too? The adventurers stood frozen, their minds still grappling with the impossible. Half a year of trials, battles, and sacrifices had led them to this moment. They had delved into lost histories, explored forbidden realms, and now treated with an archfey and lived to tell the tale. They watched in silence, their bodies tense, as Baba Yaga ascended the unnatural steps of her hut, her movements as deliberate, slow, and unbothered as ever. Each step away from them was a relief, right up until the hut's door opened. And out walked Professor Vorenthaler, welcoming the archfey back to her hut. He was sipping a cup of tea. The world lurched, time stretching unnaturally thin, as if their very reality had buckled under the weight of his presence. It hit like a thunderclap. Their blood ran cold, their bodies locked in place by something far stronger than magic, pure, unrelenting horror. Zora's pulse pounded in his skull, but it was not fear, it was rage. His vision snapped to black, every ounce of reason drowned in it as the beast within roared. Before he could move, before the others could even react, the archfey flicked her wrist without even looking back, and a wall of force erupted around them, sealing them inside a prison of untouchable power. Frizz's instincts kicked in, her fingers moved the counterspell on her lips. But she stopped. She knew she could never counter this. Not in 10 lifetimes could she unravel the magic of Baba Yaga. They were trapped, helpless, forced to watch as their worst enemy stood before them, standing beside the archfey as if it was his rightful place. Whatever his twisted game, they had played right into his hands. And then Zora changed. They had never seen him like this. His pupils vanished, his eyes turning white-hot with fury, his form swelling with unbridled rage. He threw himself at the arcane barrier, his strength a force of nature, his power palpable, monstrous. But it was in vain. The wall did not so much as ripple. He was caged, and nothing he did could change that. The professor bowed deeply, his movements elegant, every fibre of his body exuding a quiet, smug reverence as Baba Yaga approached. Without ceremony, she placed the orb in his hands. Then, with a sickening, casual ease, she tousled his hair, her fingers curling through the strands as one would a beloved pet. The professor did not flinch. Instead, he bowed again, his smile sharp, his voice smooth as silk as he spoke, promising the revered archfey a new pet in 3 months' time. She tilted her head, that same terrible smile curling at her lips as her eyes fluttered shut in amused pleasure, as if savouring a private joke only she understood. The weight of the professor's words settled over them like a death knell, the finality of it sinking deep, suffocating in its inevitability. Zora lunged again, slamming against the arcane barrier with all the force his rage could muster, his roar splitting the air, but the magic did not waver, did not even shudder beneath his fury. The professor barely spared him a glance, his expression one of absolute, unshaken victory, a quiet, knowing look that told them all exactly where they stood. Beneath him, behind him, too late to stop him. And then they were gone. No shimmer, no flare of magic, just emptiness where they had stood, their presence erased as if they had never been. The force field collapsed an instant later, sending the adventurers stumbling forward, no longer held back. Yet the weight in their chest told them what their minds already knew. The hut was gone, the professor was gone, and he was now in the possession of a Vestran orb. We end our tale today with the party standing stunned in the revelation of Professor Vorenthalor's new alliance with the archfey Baba Yaga. Until next time, brave adventurers.
Heckfire Club!